The entire first episode of The Chosen Season 6 unfolds inside a single night. Not a day, not a week. One night. And by the time that night ends, a man who healed thousands, who fed entire crowds with almost nothing, who raised the dead, is handed over to be crucified. But here is the detail that changes everything. The verdict against him was decided before he ever opened his mouth. There is something hidden inside these trial scenes, a pattern that runs through every interrogation that most viewers are going to completely miss. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Season 6 of The Chosen does something no previous season has done. It abandons the wide sweep of time that shaped every earlier chapter and locks the entire story inside a single, suffocating night, the final night before the cross. The darkness in these episodes is not just a visual atmosphere. It is a mirror of everything happening on screen. The deepest night in the Christian story, unfolding hour by hour, conversation by conversation, without pause, without escape, and without mercy. Episode 1 begins not with hope, not with healing, not with any of the moments of grace that defined what came before. It begins with a trial that was never really a trial at all. The outcome was decided before Jesus walked through the door. What happened inside those chambers was a performance, and hidden within the structure of what Jesus says and what he deliberately chooses not to say, across 4 different interrogations in a single night, is one of the most quietly profound portraits of human wisdom ever placed on screen. Most viewers will not catch it the first time. But today, we are going to break every detail wide open. To understand why Episode 1 of The Chosen Season 6 carries the kind of emotional weight that cast members have described as unlike anything they have experienced on this production before, you have to begin not with the episode itself, but with the decision the creative team made before a single frame was filmed. A decision that sets this season apart from every season that came before it, and that completely transforms the experience of watching from the very first minute. Every previous season of The Chosen told its story across a wide stretch of time. Weeks passed between scenes. Characters moved between cities, between encounters, between different seasons of their lives. Miracles happened in one location, difficult conversations in another, and quiet moments of connection somewhere in between. That format was one of the series' great strengths. It allowed relationships to develop slowly, allowed viewers to invest emotionally in each character over the course of months, and created the feeling of a world unfolding naturally rather than a story being pushed toward its conclusion. But Season 6 abandons that format entirely. Dallas Jenkins and his team made a creative decision as bold as it is devastating. The entire season focuses on a single day, specifically, a single night. The final night before the crucifixion of Jesus. This is not a minor creative shift. It fundamentally changes the texture of what is being experienced. There is no breathing room between significant moments. There is no cutting forward to a quieter scene in a different location that gives the audience time to recover from what just happened. Every scene follows directly from the one before it. Every conversation carries the accumulated weight of everything that has led to this point, and every moment of silence feels like something being paid for. The story does not let the audience look away, and according to Dallas Jenkins, that was entirely intentional. The production wanted viewers inside that night, not observing it from a comfortable distance, but experiencing it in real time, hour by hour, as the road to the cross becomes not just inevitable, but undeniable. To reflect the gravity of these events, the production team also committed to a filming schedule unlike anything in the history of the series. Season 6 was shot over 86 days, nearly 3 full weeks longer than any previous season. That is not simply a production record. It is a statement about the level of care being brought to every single moment on screen. These are the defining events of the gospel story. The trial, the betrayal, the suffering, and the death of Jesus have stood at the center of Christian faith for nearly 2,000 years. The production team understood that they could not be compressed, abbreviated, or handled with anything less than complete attention. Every conversation, every location, and every moment of stillness was given the time it needed to breathe and to communicate not just what happened in these events, but what they meant. A significant portion of filming took place in Matera, an ancient city in southern Italy whose stone streets and centuries-old architecture have long made it a destination for biblical storytelling on film. But Matera carries a significance that goes beyond its visual qualities. This is the same city where Mel Gibson chose to film the crucifixion sequences in The Passion of the Christ. By returning to those same streets, those same stones, that same light and shadow, The Chosen is placing its portrayal of Jesus' final hours in direct conversation with one of the most powerful depictions of those events in cinematic history. That choice is not accidental. It is a quiet declaration of intent, an acknowledgement that what is being attempted in Season 6 belongs to a tradition of storytelling about these specific events that carries enormous cultural and spiritual weight. Now step inside Episode 1 and into the night itself. The episode opens with Jesus already past the point of no return. The Garden of Gethsemane is behind him. His prayer, the one in which he knelt before the Father and asked whether this cup could pass from him, before ultimately surrendering with complete willingness to what was required, is finished. The soldiers have arrived, and he allowed himself to be taken. He did not resist. He did not call on any power to protect him. He did not disappear into the night, as he easily could have. He allowed the arrest to happen with the full awareness of someone who understands exactly where this night leads, and who has already accepted that destination with everything in him. From the garden, Jesus is brought before Annas. This is where many viewers will encounter their first surprise, because the trial of Jesus is often compressed in popular memory into a single dramatic courtroom scene that ends in a quick death sentence. But the gospel accounts record clearly that the trial unfolded through a series of distinct stages, each one moving Jesus a step closer to the cross, and The Chosen's Episode 1 appears determined to follow that sequence with care, to give each stage the space and weight it deserves, rather than collapsing the entire proceeding into one overwhelming moment. Annas is no longer the acting high priest, but his influence within the religious establishment remains enormous. Leaders within the system continue to look to him for direction, and it is to him that Jesus is brought first, not for a formal hearing before the full council, but for a preliminary interrogation conducted before the official proceedings begin. The stated purpose is to gather information. The real purpose is to build a case. Annas questions Jesus about his disciples and his teachings, searching for material that might later be shaped into evidence usable against him in a more formal setting. Jesus responds without hesitation. His answer is composed, clear, and completely without defensiveness. He simply points to the obvious truth. His entire ministry was conducted in public. He taught in synagogues, in the temple courts, in open spaces before crowds that numbered in the thousands. Every word he ever spoke was spoken in front of witnesses. There was no hidden network. There was no secret doctrine reserved for the inner circle. If the authorities genuinely wanted to know what Jesus had taught, the witnesses they needed were not difficult to find. They were the thousands of people who had listened with their own ears. His answer does not just address the question. It exposes the question itself as dishonest. There is nothing to uncover because nothing was ever concealed. And then comes the moment that changes the entire atmosphere of the episode. Before any verdict has been reached, before any formal proceeding has moved past its opening stage, a guard standing near Jesus strikes him across the face. That blow is brief. It occupies only a moment on screen. But what it communicates is enormous. Physical violence arrives before any finding of guilt, before any legal conclusion, before the proceeding has even properly concluded its first stage. It is a signal, unmistakable to anyone watching closely, that justice has already been replaced by something else. The decision to condemn Jesus was made before he entered that room, and those carrying out that decision have little patience for even the appearance of fairness. The slap is not an act of individual anger. It is power demonstrating that it has no intention of being restrained by its own stated principles. And if the chosen delivers this moment with the quiet devastation it deserves, it will become one of the most telling images of the entire season. From Annas, Jesus is taken to Caiaphas, the serving high priest, and brought before the Sanhedrin, the highest religious council in all of Israel, comprised of the most influential spiritual leaders the nation possesses. These are men entrusted with the interpretation of the law and the moral guidance of an entire people. And what they have gathered to do in this chamber is not to pursue the truth about the man standing before them. They have gathered to find a legal justification for a sentence they have already determined to deliver. Witness after witness is brought forward to testify. But the strategy begins to fail almost immediately. One accusation contradicts another. Details from separate testimonies fail to align. The evidence fractures under its own weight, and it becomes increasingly clear to everyone in that room that the case being assembled against Jesus cannot hold together. The witnesses are not revealing his guilt. They are revealing the weakness of the prosecution. And the more witnesses are called, the more obvious that weakness becomes, until the entire proceeding begins to expose something it was never supposed to expose: the absence of a legitimate case. Recognizing that the witnesses are accomplishing nothing, Caiaphas abandons the strategy and turns directly to the man standing before him, with the only question that actually matters to the outcome he has already determined. Are you the Messiah? The chamber goes still. Every eye turns toward Jesus, and he answers, without hesitation, without softening, without any attempt to protect himself from what that answer will cost him. You have said so. And then he continues, telling those present that from this moment forward, they will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. In the context of Hebrew scripture, those words are unmistakably specific. They invoke the language of messianic prophecy, language that anyone in that room who had spent their life studying the texts would recognize immediately. Jesus is not being vague or ambiguous. He is making the fullest possible declaration of who he is, in a room full of people who want him dead, with complete calm and complete certainty. For Caiaphas, it is enough. He tears his robes before the council, a dramatic and ritualized expression of outrage, and declares that Jesus has committed blasphemy. The search for evidence is over. The verdict is pronounced, and what remains now is not a question of guilt, but a question of execution, because the Sanhedrin, under Roman occupation, does not hold the legal authority to carry out a death sentence on its own. If Jesus is to die, the Roman governor must authorize it. The religious trial is over. The case is now moving from the authority of the temple into the authority of Rome, where entirely different forces, political, imperial, deeply personal, will determine what happens next. There is something running through every interrogation in Episode 1 that most viewers will not consciously notice the first time they watch. It is not a single dramatic revelation or a surprise piece of information. It is a pattern, one threaded through every encounter Jesus faces across this entire night. And when it is identified and understood, it reframes every scene completely and reveals a dimension of these events that is easy to miss when watching them unfold one after another. Throughout Episode 1, Jesus faces 4 separate interrogators: Annas, Caiaphas, Herod Antipas, and Pontius Pilate. Each encounter takes place in a different setting. Each is driven by different motivations and a different kind of power. And critically, the way Jesus responds to each of them is completely different. Not subtly different. Significantly, deliberately, and unmistakably different in each case. That difference is not a reflection of mood or circumstance. It is a reflection of Jesus' precise understanding of who each person is, what they are genuinely seeking, and what kind of response is most honest and most truthful to that specific encounter. And when you see it, the trial stops being a sequence of legal proceedings and becomes one of the most carefully constructed portraits of wisdom and discernment ever placed on screen. Before Annas, Jesus speaks with logic and directness. The interrogation is framed as a genuine search for information, but it is not, and Jesus' response cuts through that pretense without raising his voice and without a single statement that could be weaponized against him in the next stage of the trial. By pointing out that his entire ministry was public and witnessed by thousands, he exposes the dishonest nature of the questioning simply by telling the truth about it. He speaks here because the moment calls for clear, unambiguous exposure of what is actually happening. Silence in this context would change nothing. Truth in this context says everything. Before Caiaphas, Jesus speaks again, but only once, and only when the question finally demands the fullest possible answer. When Caiaphas abandons the failing witness strategy and asks directly whether Jesus is the Messiah, he is, almost certainly without intending to, asking the one genuinely honest question of the entire proceeding. The identity of Jesus is the real issue. It has always been the real issue. Every other accusation has been a distraction from this one central question. And when that question is asked directly, Jesus answers it directly. He does not calculate the consequences and decide to soften the response. He does not hedge. He gives the fullest possible answer because the fullest possible answer is the truthful one, and the truthful answer is the only answer Jesus will give to a genuine question, even when that answer is the thing that seals his fate in the room where he is standing. Then comes Herod, and here everything changes. Jesus says nothing, not a single word across the entire encounter. Herod has been curious about Jesus for some time. He has heard the stories about the miracles and arrives at the hearing with a sense of anticipation, not the anticipation of a judge seeking justice, but the anticipation of a powerful man who expects to be shown something impressive. He questions Jesus. He waits. He tries again. He receives nothing in return. No defense, no miracle, no engagement of any kind. The silence is absolute and unbroken. Most viewers will understand this scene as Jesus simply refusing to dignify someone unworthy of a response. But the significance goes considerably further. Herod Antipas did not come to that hearing seeking truth. He came seeking spectacle. His curiosity about Jesus was never moral or spiritual. It was the curiosity of someone who wanted something extraordinary to witness, something that would give him a story to tell. And Jesus, who used words with extraordinary precision throughout his entire ministry, understood exactly what kind of engagement was being requested. He refused to provide it. There is nothing to say to someone who arrived not to understand, but to be entertained. The silence before Herod is not passivity. It is the most deliberate and considered response Jesus could possibly give, a complete withholding from a man whose approach to this encounter deserves exactly that. And then Jesus is returned to Pilate. Here he speaks again, but minimally. When Pilate asks whether he is the king of the Jews, Jesus answers, "You say that I am." It is measured. It is neither a full confession nor a denial. It is a response that places the weight of interpretation where it belongs, directly in Pilate's hands. And Pilate, who repeatedly finds himself unable to locate any crime in the man standing before him, keeps arriving at the same conclusion. I find no fault in him. Jesus gives Pilate enough truth to make the right choice completely obvious, and then leaves the choice entirely to Pilate, because the choice belongs to Pilate, and that, Jesus seems to understand with perfect clarity, is how it must be. Taken together, this pattern is not coincidence, and it is not variation driven by fatigue or pressure. Jesus approached every interrogator with precise awareness of who they were, what they were seeking, and what kind of response would be most truthful to that specific moment. Before genuine questions, he gave complete answers. Before dishonest proceedings, he gave exposure. Before vanity and spectacle, he gave silence. Before a troubled conscience caught between knowing what is right and having the courage to do it, he gave just enough truth to make the choice undeniable, and then stepped back. That is not survival behavior. That is not the passive endurance of someone being processed through a system beyond his control. That is mastery. And when the chosen renders these encounters with the full emotional depth its cast has invested in them, viewers may find themselves watching not a man subjected to a series of legal proceedings, but a man who navigates every single one of those proceedings from a position of complete awareness and complete intentionality, beginning to end. Now consider the physical reality of how these scenes were created. Dallas Jenkins confirmed that nearly the entire season takes place at night, and the production team was genuinely filming through the night, immersed in darkness, to capture the atmosphere of these events with authentic precision. That level of commitment across 86 days of filming, the longest production schedule in the history of the series, left marks on everyone involved that go beyond the professional. Jonathan Rumi, who portrays Jesus, has spoken openly about what this season cost him. He calls Season 6 the most demanding role of his career, not primarily because of the physical requirements, though those were real and significant. He lost weight and muscle during the process of production. The crucifixion sequences required extended days of physically exhausting work in conditions that were genuinely demanding. But Rumi has been explicit that the physical toll was not the heaviest part of what this season asked of him. The greater weight was the responsibility of carrying, from scene to scene and day after day, the full emotional and spiritual reality of what his character is experiencing during these final hours. That responsibility, he said, affected him in ways no previous season had. The shift from portraying Jesus teaching, healing, and calling disciples to portraying Jesus walking knowingly and willingly toward the cross, demanded something from him that went beyond performance into something considerably more personal. Elizabeth Tabish, who plays Mary Magdalene, reflected on how emotionally difficult the crucifixion sequences were from her character's perspective. By this point in the story, Mary Magdalene is not simply one follower among many. Her entire life has been transformed through her encounter with Jesus. To watch, as her character and as an actress, the person who gave her back her life being tortured, mocked, and humiliated, is something she described as genuinely heartbreaking. Even in the controlled environment of a film set, even knowing that every element is constructed, the emotional reality of what Mary Magdalene is witnessing in these scenes was not something that could simply be switched off. The relationship the series has built over 5 seasons between this character and Jesus gives every moment of his suffering, in Season 6, an added emotional dimension that viewers who have followed the show from the beginning will feel before any of it is explained. Abi Bueno Giad, who plays Big James, traveled to the filming location in Matera on days he was not required to be on set, not because his schedule demanded it, but because he wanted to witness what was being created there. He described the atmosphere among the cast and crew as unlike anything he had observed in any previous season, a level of focus and total immersion that left him, at certain moments during production, with goosebumps. The sense he conveyed is not of a television production working through its process. It is of people who believe the story they are telling carries a weight that reaches beyond what can be contained in the production itself. And then there is the scope of what is coming. Dallas Jenkins confirmed that the final episode of Season 6, depicting the crucifixion, grew during the writing process into something far larger than a standard streaming episode could contain. He described pouring everything into that screenplay because he understood he was writing what he considers the most significant event in human history. When the script was shared with the Come and See Foundation, the nonprofit organization that helps fund the series, the response was not simply approval. It was encouragement to expand the scope further and release the finale as a full theatrical film, planned for May 12, 2027, with a budget expected to reach approximately $30 million. At the time of that announcement, nearly $16 million had already been raised through crowdfunding, reflecting the extraordinary depth of audience commitment the series continues to generate. Plans also include a separate theatrical release for the opening chapter of Season 7, covering the resurrection of Jesus on Easter weekend, March 31st, 2028. What began as a crowd-funded streaming series has grown into something capable of placing the most defining moments in the gospel story on cinema screens around the world. And Episode 1 of Season 6 is where that journey begins. The information confirmed so far about Episode 1 of The Chosen Season 6 raises a number of fascinating questions about how the season will continue to develop, and about several moments from that same single night that have not yet been discussed in detail. Based on everything confirmed by the production team, combined with what the Gospel accounts record about these specific events, it is possible to piece together some reasonable theories about what is coming and how the series is likely to approach it. One of the most significant questions involves Peter's denial. According to the Gospel accounts, Peter's 3 denials of Jesus, among the most emotionally devastating moments in the entire Passion narrative, occurred on this same night, the very night that Episode 1 covers. The Peter that viewers of The Chosen have watched across 5 seasons is a man defined by passionate, sometimes reckless devotion. He declared with total sincerity that he would never abandon Jesus. He meant it. And yet, within hours of that declaration, he denied 3 times. To a servant girl in a courtyard, under no threat greater than embarrassment, that he ever knew the man. This moment is among the most anticipated of the entire season. It is possible that Episode 1 intercuts Peter's denials with the trial sequences, showing both stories unfolding in parallel on the same night, the religious leaders betraying Jesus on one side, and his closest friend doing the same on the other, separated only by a courtyard and a few hundred feet. It is also possible that the production holds Peter's denial for a later episode, giving it the full, uninterrupted emotional weight it deserves without being compressed alongside the trial. Either approach would be defensible. Either could be devastating. But given the season's stated commitment to inhabiting every moment of this night without cutting away, it seems likely that Peter's story will be present in Episode 1 in some significant form. The story of what happens to Judas in the aftermath of the betrayal is another thread that could define major portions of the season. Judas set these events in motion. His agreement with the chief priests and his identification of Jesus in the garden are what made the arrest possible. But according to the gospel accounts, Judas's story does not end at that moment. What follows, his guilt, his attempt to return the 30 pieces of silver, and ultimately his fate, runs parallel to the trial itself. It is possible that Season 6 gives this story considerably more emotional depth and screen time than any previous portrayal of these events has attempted, treating Judas not simply as a villain whose story ends at the moment of betrayal, but as a portrait of someone who understood too late the full weight of what he had done. The Chosen has consistently humanized figures who are often reduced to symbols. It would be entirely consistent with the series' approach to give Judas's aftermath the same unflinching, compassionate treatment it has given to every other complicated character across 5 seasons. Perhaps the most intriguing possibility involves the women who, according to the gospel accounts, remained close to Jesus through these events, while the male disciples largely scattered. Mary Magdalene's emotional journey through the crucifixion has already been confirmed as central to the season's storytelling. But it is possible that Season 6 gives unprecedented space to the experience of all the women who stayed, who watched, who did not run, who stood near the cross, and who were, by the end of that same weekend, the first witnesses of everything that would change the world. If the season is truly committed to slowing down and inhabiting every moment of this night and the day that follows, those perspectives could be given a depth that transforms Season 6 from a passion narrative into something closer to a complete portrait of how these events were experienced by every person who was present for them. Whatever specific choices the Chosen makes, in the episodes that follow, the foundation established by Episode 1 points clearly toward one consistent direction. A season that refuses to rush, that trusts the emotional and spiritual weight of these events to do their work if given enough room to breathe. And that treats the final night of Jesus' earthly life not as a sequence of familiar scenes to be efficiently reproduced, but as a living story, experienced in real time by real people, whose faith, failure, courage, and love were each tested in those hours beyond anything they had ever faced before.